Marriage and couples therapists. Have you ever simply told the couple they were not right for each other? How often have you met a couple whose problems were unresolvable? I would note that in my training we are taught that it is unethical to continue couples therapy with a relationship where one partner is abusing the other. Maisel and her former husband were in this situation. He was as abusive. Their therapist basically told her that he couldn't continue working with them because her husband was abusive and she should leave him. I give a lot of props to that therapist since this was in a highly conservative religious area where divorce is really frowned upon. And this was a specifically religious therapist. My uncle was a religious leader and a couple went to him for counseling. He said that was the only couple where he advised the wife to divorce her husband. Her husband was addicted to Star Trek. He worked part-time so he could watch old episode reruns and had a whole room dedicated to Star Trek. Toys, DVDs, posters, etc. He checked out of his marriage. Sex life was non-existent. He had no interest in being a father to his kids. And was basically a troll in the basement. He had no intention of changing and didn't want to give up any Star Trek time. Wife took the advice. Got a divorce. Lost a bunch of weight. Looks better and feels better. She told my uncle months later that she feels happier than she has in years. I've been a licensed marriage and family therapist for 15 years. I've worked with couples who have improved their relationships and others who have divorced. I would never come out and say I don't think they are going to make it. But work with them to realize their own needs and wants. Generally though, my intuition is pretty good on how a relationship will turn out. There isn't a formula or certain set of circumstances that lead to a certain outcome. Generally issues arise as we move the different life phases. My now ex-wife and I went to counseling. After 3 sessions. The only thing it did was convince me I needed to leave her. Let me preface by saying my ex's father was a piece of shit. He was a Lutheran minister that cheated on his wife so many times he lost his job and his wife left him. So he became a therapist. As a couples therapist he saw his job as walking one person through the hoops that the other had already checked out of the relationship. Then the weaker of the splitting couple became a regular. His patients became his minions after that. He'd keep them coming back week after week and they would do errands for him. Not me. But a counselor told my sister that her husband was a textbook narcissist and she needed to get herself and her children as far away from him as she could. And this was a religious counselor that claimed to not believe in divorce. Lol. Marriage therapist here. I specialize in affairs. Never. That's not what therapy is about. Relationship therapy is about clarity and about pushing aside defense mechanisms in order to access authentic, vulnerable, real selves in learning how to love and be loved. Any therapist who says problems are unresolvable is a therapist who is focusing in on the wrong goal. I have, however, looked at a couple and said perhaps I'm not the best therapist for you. As what I have to offer doesn't seem to be getting us anywhere. This. When we all feel stuck. Usually that is because someone is not being honest. Not a marriage counselor. But my dad tried to get my mom to go to couples therapy before their divorce. Apparently 3 sessions in the therapist turned to my mom and asked if she actually intended on listening or if she just hoped counseling would prove that my dad was the problem. And she just got up and walked out. Counselor told my dad therapy would only work if both parties put in an effort. And it was clear this was gonna be one-sided. Dad filed for divorce a week later. Is much happier now. Mom's still a miserable hunt. Oh, my counselor has a good one for this. Been with him for almost a decade, so I've asked these questions. On the first meeting he says I'm going to try and talk you out of your relationship. Because if a single person without sex or alcohol can talk you out of it, you probably don't belong together. With that said, he would never explicitly say you shouldn't be together. Again. What he said was it's my job to help you realize they should or shouldn't be together. Not outright tell you. My husband and I have some friends who were receiving couples counseling. She would tell me what the therapist said to do and he would tell my husband. When my husband and I would talk about things after, we noticed the therapist was telling them to completely different things. Our friends had been seeing her for years and were starting to think their problems were unresolvable. It was our theory that the therapist was doing this as a way to keep clients coming back to her. We advised our friends to seek a different therapist. Not directly related to the question, but I had a friend who had been married for 2 years. He and his wife were both 20. The husband wasn't anything to write home about and his wife was a solid 8.5. Anyways, this was in 1999 and he was addicted to EverQuest. He would get home from work and say hi to his wife and head over to his game room to play EQ. This went on for months and he basically refused to have sex with her. They went to counseling and the counselor actually said, "Look man, your wife is very attractive. Do you want her sleeping with other men?" I guess that scared him, so he ended up selling his computer. Not a counselor. But when my wife and I first married, because we had a child, we went to a counselor. Actually, it was 2 counselors. It was a college thing where it was free because they were training. Big mirror at the back, facing us. Anyways, 15 minutes into our first, and only, session and it's clear that there's really nothing to say. One counselor just kinda shrugs and is quiet. The other starts yelling at me that I'm not affectionate enough towards my infant kids in the room. Lol. She was from Africa. Not sure why I remember that. Apparently didn't handle failure well. She called and apologized afterwards, but wow. Anyways, probably happens more times than not. By the time you get to a counselor. My mother told me about when her and my father went to marriage therapy. This conclusion ultimately occurred when my father referred to me and my many half-brothers and sisters as those kids that kid. This happened over many sessions. And add another charming qualities my father showed during the therapy as well. I can't recall how many, but my mother was eventually pulled aside and told to divorce this man and go live a happy life with your son, without him ever being around. Well, 28 years later, I was 4 when all this happened. The therapist was right. My mother was the best parent I could ever have asked for. My adopted sister, 2 years younger than me, and I had the best childhood you could ask for. My sister would ask, "Where is daddy?" My mother's reply to her was, "God gave me enough love and care for you and you M16 and knocked up." My mother never bashed my father nor said a bad word about him until my sister and I were in our late teens. To this day my mother still appreciates the therapist who helped her realize she needed to leave. I had a therapist tell me that once. She was, of course, right. When my parents went to counseling, the therapist said, "In my whole career I've never seen 2 people who push each other's buttons more than you 2. They are still married but the relationship is pretty toxic if you ask me. I don't know how they ended up together because they really are extremely incompatible." Yes. In my experience, a woman desperately wanted to remain with her husband. Their marriage had gone south and she set up weeks of sessions. She refused to leave him and told me she would always be a patient and forgiving wife. Her husband was disrespectful to her in therapy, trying to convince me she was a terrible and inadequate wife, cursing, spitting, the whole lot. There was no excuse or reason to justify to the things he would say about her. Meanwhile, she'd be in session nearly doubled over in tears. Her husband later was speculated a narcissist, but refused any psychological assessments. She put up with years of abuse, and even got stood up expecting her husband to show up to sessions on multiple occasions. I couldn't work with him. It was clear he had no desire to change. This makes therapy extremely difficult. I told them I could not see them as a couple any longer. I advised the wife to divorce, as I was aware of the abuse, and suggested to them the relationship was toxic. I knew I was biased towards his wife, and had developed negative feelings toward him, therefore, unethical therapy. The guy was an asshole. I couldn't even bring myself to pretend to be neutral in any fashion and cut him off as soon as possible. I continued seeing her individually for a while, but she relocated. Hope she's doing great. Therapist here. I have a lot more experience with family therapy as opposed to just strictly seeing couples. Generally it wouldn't be appropriate to tell a client what to do, especially with an enormous life decision like divorce. I did see a couple where I thought it was very unlikely that they'd be able to reconcile because they would not put aside their need to hurt each other emotionally in order to do the necessary work to repair their marriage. Plus the wife had disclosed to me that she only was staying in the marriage out of guilt and was miserable. I might ask questions like, do you feel like living this way is sustainable etc. to get the gears turning. Generally I help people feel more confident about how they're already feeling what they already want to do. I did as an intern. They never came back. They didn't have any insurmountable issues. I just didn't know what I was doing and had no training in this area. So I suggested that maybe they split if they just keep bitching about each other. I still don't do couples or family therapy. Years ago when I was engaged to my first husband, and we had just moved in together, we were having a lot of problems, so I suggested we go to a therapist to get on track before getting married. The therapist suggested to me that maybe I wasn't in the right relationship and shouldn't get married. Capital I. Of course. Didn't listen. And insisted that I loved him regardless of his faults, and at the time, borderline abusive behavior. So the therapist then said, well, then you are going to need to lower your expectations. Because he isn't going to change. I married him. And flash forward 5 years. When we have a 4-year-old. And my husband hits me in front of him. He has hit me before. Just not in front of our kid. He has also destroyed me financially. And isolated me from most of my friends and family. He is also having multiple affairs. But wants to stay married because he is unemployed and wants me to support him. I ended up having to get a restraining order. He responded by slashing my tires multiple times. He'd slash them. I'd get them fixed. He'd slash them again. Breaking into my garage and denting my car and breaking my windshield. Breaking into my house and cutting router wires. Stealing our son's dog. And turning off the breakers so when we came home late there would be no lights. His reign of terror lasted for 2 months. All the while he was fighting me in court for joint custody of our son. The police finally caught him red-handed at 2 AM in front of my mom's house. Drunk and with a weapon. He went away to prison for 18 months. I got a 10-year criminal restraining order. And even 6 years since he hasn't been able to get any custody or visitation with our son. Thank God. But none of it would have happened had I just listened to that therapist. Our therapist told us at the beginning of our sessions that she would tell us if she ever felt our marriage was unsustainable. 3rd or 4th session in she said she saw some heavy underlying problems and didn't know if we were repairable. She had met with us each separately as well as jointly. I didn't know what or why our major problems were. My wife and I decided to continue therapy. After a few months of sessions. When my wife finally told me, a complete surprise, that she had been unfaithful multiple times and currently had a boyfriend. I called our therapist for direction. The doctor told me she was dropping my wife as a client. And would from then on be solely my therapist. Turns out doc was spot on. She told me now I knew some of the things. That she'd tried to get my wife to tell me other things as well, but she couldn't divulge what had been discussed in private sessions. Doc said she had been trying to hint to me to GTFO earlier. Happened to me. I went to counseling with my ex-wife and after 3 sessions or so the counselor asked us what we would be willing to do in an attempt to reach a compromise. I answered truthfully that I would be interested in a continuation of the marriage but not at the expense of having to 100% give in every time to her demands. Then she was asked the same question and the answer basically was, paraphrased, I would be willing to accept the continuation if I would be willing to do as she asks of me. It was not the exact words. But the meaning was just the same. The counselor looked back at me. Looked into my eyes and said, verbatim, you got your answer. I filed for divorce the next day. Very much to her surprise. Because we just were in counseling and that was going so well. Obligatory, not a therapist, but a part of the couple. After our second session, she suggested we separate. We didn't make it to the third as I had to call her and let her know that the ex was in hospital from a suicide attempt, which he later admitted was a drunken manipulative attempt to make me stay. His theory was that I would go out, see him laying there bleeding, and everything would go back to happy families. Except I didn't find him until 7 hours later when he had knocked on death's door. When my now ex and I were going through therapy, she was going on and on about all the things she did right and all the things I did wrong, to the point where the therapist said, "You're never wrong. Are you?" My ex took it as a compliment. Something tells me that this would go about as well as that good friend trying to warn you that the soon-to-be wife husband is a narcissist and to rethink it. I'm a professional therapist. It would be unethical. It is not our job to give that kind of advice. That's not how therapy works. My late husband and I went to marriage therapy for a while. During one of our 9 AM sessions, the therapist pulled me aside and told me he could smell alcohol on my husband. I myself couldn't smell it, but I wasn't surprised as he was an alcoholic. Anyway, I told my husband when we got home the therapist smelled him, and of course my husband got mad at me. Then he refused to go back. The next session I went alone, and after the full hour the therapist told me to get a lawyer and leave him. I didn't, and had 2 more miserable years before he died from all the damage alcohol did to his heart over the years. I went for couples counseling with my partner because we wanted a second opinion on some life stuff. We went before anything was critical, but we were trying to figure out next direction sort of stuff. So he sits us down, guides us to sit opposite one another instead of next to each other. He takes turn asking us individual questions. I answered on her behalf once, and he tells me somewhat tersely that he directed that question towards her and that I need to wait my turn. Eventually he drops this nugget of wisdom: sometimes things are untenable and it's best just to separate while things are still amiable. At which point I look at my partner and she looks at me, and we burst into giggles. This methodica thinks we're splitting up, has been careful to set sides and be equitable in our treatment, and we just wanted to ask about options of compromise for our aspirations. We weren't on the verge of ruin and breakup. We still loved and adored each other. We forgot to tell him that, though. I was surprised at how quickly he tossed out the "it's okay to break up" shtick. It was within 5-10 minutes of the session starting. Ike. Nearly graduated couples therapist here. Generally there aren't many issues that can come up that are completely unresolvable, but there are some. Generally though, it just comes down to compromising, and if you can actually slow down and hear your partner properly. Sadly, many couples come to therapy too late for this and simply can't muster up the motivation to complete homework assignments or really take what us therapists say to heart. It's kinda sad. But the couples who I've seen be the most successful in therapy are the ones who come in early on when they recognize a problem, are fully committed to one another, and really put effort into things. Only 40% of work done in therapy is really up to the therapist. The rest is up to the clients. Therapists can only do so much. Former therapist. There is no such thing as being right for each other. Any 2 people can make a positive life together if they so choose. However, communication, understanding, and acceptance play huge roles in that. At times, it becomes pretty clear either one or both partners aren't willing to compromise or come together on certain issues. But to answer your question, I've never gone out and said it because a good therapist shouldn't. But I have said that things needs to be addressed and both need to take a more active role in their marriage relationship, otherwise it is bound to fail. In all my years of marriage counseling, I've realized the one sign that a couple won't make it. They show contempt for each other. Not even hatred or anger. Just disdain. Eye rolling. Diminishing one another's points etc. I wish I could send a screenshot of this to a friend to prove my point. But his wife made him block me, which should have proved it in the first place. My therapist told my first husband and I that we should divorce after the first session. There was nothing bad about our marriage other than I was bored and didn't feel like we were a good partnership. He wanted to work on it and I thought I also did, but I realized that I just wanted to do whatever I wanted and wished my husband would accept that. Turns out that is not a willing attitude for a happy marriage. That is just one person wanting to be independent and do their own thing. We divorced and I was immediately happy. He wasn't. He became happy about 2 years later. That was many years ago. I am glad that therapist was honest and didn't push us to stay together.